Well, thank you to Gulru and thank you to the Aga Khan program for inviting me to speak, and thank you all for coming. In the mid-13th century, Rodrigo Jimenez de Rada, Archbishop of Toledo and champion of the series of battles against the Muslims of Iberia that would later be enshrined as the Reconquista, sat down to write what he called the Historia Arabum, History of the Arabs. Thanks in part to Rodrigo's intercession with the Pope, the Marrakesh-based Almohad dynasty, which had ruled much of Islamic Iberia for the previous century, had been definitively defeated in a battle officially termed a crusade, and the time of the Muslims in Iberia seemed to be coming to a close. Rodrigo's Historia Arabum described the battles between the Christians and the North African Berber dynasties that had consumed the previous century. In this narrative, Rodrigo paused to praise a particular Muslim ruler who, like his Christian neighbors, had fought the Almohads. He wrote, "Now there was a man who was endowed with wisdom and was generous, energetic, and kind, Muhammad ibn Sa'd, who later became known as the Wolf King, Rex Lupus in Latin. He won the kingdom of Valencia and the kingdom of Murcia, as well as the areas around them." It's fine if you want to focus on that, that's fine. It'll be hard to see. Right now I don't have very pretty images, but I will soon, and then you'll definitely want to see them. So he later became known as the Wolf King. He won the kingdom of Valencia and the kingdom of Murcia, as well as the areas around them, including Lorca and Guadix and many other places. Many Christians also lived there. This figure, Muhammad ibn Sa'd ibn Mardanish, known in Christian sources as the Wolf King, Rex Lupus, or the Castilian Rey Lobo, presents a challenge to the vision of Muslim-Christian enmity so prominent in chronicles of the 12th and 13th centuries. He was a vassal to the Christian king Alfonso VIII, paid tribute to the Count Kings of Barcelona, and established permanent trade delegations for Genoese and Pisan merchants in the port of Almeria. He ruled nearly half of al-Andalus, so that's the area in light green, for 30 years, fighting the Almohads alongside Christian armies and assisting his Christian allies against their Christian enemies. Christian sources like the Historia Arabum tend to portray him positively. One pope sent him a letter commending him for protecting the Christians under his rule so well, and another pope referred to him as Wolf King of glorious memory after his death, and that's where the title of my book comes from. His portrayal in contemporary Arabic sources is more mixed. In the sources written for Almohad patrons, Ibn Mardanish is condemned for his close relationships with Christians and for refusing to accept Almohad authority. In another Arabic source, he's called a hero provided by God for the benefit of the Muslims of al-Andalus. But later Arabic sources and modern scholarship alike imply that Ibn Mardanish's alliances with Christians suggest his religious insincerity as a Muslim. This intriguing figure is the subject of my book. This shield on the right is from 1983. It's obviously not medieval, but it shows the way in which this figure, Ibn Mardanish, has been appropriated as a kind of a nationalist hero in the region of Murcia, where he was based. He's portrayed as a kind of proto-European, proto-secular Andalusi. And this was made for a parade in Murcia, a regional parade. Because he does not fit neatly into the vision of polarized Christian-Muslim warfare that most chronicles of the period present, Ibn Mardanish has traditionally been portrayed as a subversive figure, a crypto-Christian or a particularly European and therefore proto-secular Muslim. I argue that Ibn Mardanish's alliances with Christians, far from demonstrating his lack of loyalty to Islam, were born from his commitment to Sunni ideals of Islamic authority that the Almohads challenged. When faced with their radical reformulation of the Islamic political and religious system, Ibn Mardanish turned to his powerful Christian neighbors to help him fight the Almohads. At the same time, Ibn Mardanish began a program of legitimation that reinforced traditional caliphal forms of power, becoming the first Andalusi ruler to officially acknowledge the Abbasid Caliph by name on his coins, and building palaces that incorporated the kingly iconography of the Umayyad and Fatimid caliphates. Even though his cultural production demonstrates that Ibn Mardanish was deeply involved in the debate over righteous spiritual authority in Islam, his treatment in later medieval and modern sources reflects a vision of the period in which all conflict was Christian-Muslim. In my talk tonight, I'll focus particularly on the architecture and coins of this enigmatic figure and their echoes in later cultural production. I'll begin by situating Ibn Mardanish in the broader context of Islamic history and the Western Mediterranean, and then turn to a brief survey of his cultural production. I'll end with a discussion of the ways in which the cultural forms that Ibn Mardanish introduced into the Iberian Peninsula as part of his program of political legitimation continued in structures and objects produced for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim patrons after his death. In Islamic history, the period from the 10th to the 15th century is often called the Middle Period, and as its name would suggest, it was a time of great transition. Between the 10th and 15th centuries, Islam went from being the religion of an elite, mostly Arab group who ruled largely non-Muslim subjects to being the faith of the majority of people living in an empire that spanned from China to Spain. The mass conversions that spurred this change and the vast geographic expanse of this empire made it difficult for the Abbasids to maintain centralized power. This resulted in a proliferation of new political and religious forms and the emergence of different sectarian groups and competing dynasties. The Almohads of North Africa were one of the dynasties that emerged in this time of great flux. In the 12th century, an enigmatic figure named Ibn Tumart proclaimed himself to be the Mahdi, a figure who was thought would rule the world at the end of times. He and his successors, the Almohad caliphs, radically reinterpreted standard Sunni approaches to legal and social questions, and Shia approaches too, for that matter. They rejected traditional Sunni legal frameworks and, among other changes, issued decrees calling for the conversion or expulsion of all Jews and Christians in their territories. From the mid-12th through the mid-13th centuries, the Almohads, based in Marrakesh, ruled most of the Maghreb and al-Andalus. They believed their new caliphate, rooted in messianic conception of authority, brought Islam back to the ideals of its early period. Ibn Mardanish fought the Almohads and ruled Sharq al-Andalus, southeastern Iberia, for nearly 30 years. And he was the single most powerful independent ruler in al-Andalus and constituted the greatest threat to the Almohads in the Iberian Peninsula. During his time in power, Murcia became one of the most powerful cities in the peninsula, a center of construction and cultural production, and the ports of Valencia and Denia became major stops in Mediterranean trade. His alliances with Castile and Barcelona helped to maintain power against the armies of the Almohads, and the position of his kingdom also served them as a kind of a buffer to protect them from the Almohads. While other Muslims made alliances with Christians and other Christians with other Muslims, Ibn Mardanish's successes against the Almohads made him a hero for those Iberians who resented their new overlords, including the Jews and Christians who were being threatened with expulsion or death unless they converted to Almohadism. But his successes against the Almohads and his alliances with the Christians also made him a prominent target of Almohad and later Muslim writers who presented Ibn Mardanish as a crypto-Christian, or at least an insincere Muslim. Before I get into talking about his cultural production, I just want to say a little note about his name. As you might have noticed, the name Mardanish is a really weird one, and its use in historical sources reflects a fixation on this figure's Christian roots. And that in turn reflects growing anxiety starting in the later 13th and then 14th century about alliances across religious lines. So contemporary Almohad sources, actually all contemporary sources, refer to Ibn Mardanish in Arabic as Muhammad ibn Sa'd, which is his given name. But later sources call him by the name of his great-grandfather, Ibn Mardanish. Even within a single source, within a single Arabic source, the positive sections of his narrative call him Muhammad ibn Sa'd, and the negative portions call him Ibn Mardanish, like in Ibn al-Khatib's Ihata. Mardanish is a word without a traditional Arabic root, and it's clearly derived from another language. And the biographical scholar Ibn Khalikan suggested that Mardanish was derived from the Romance word for human excrement. Modern scholars, while they have rejected this particular etymology, have agreed with Ibn Khalikan that this proves that Ibn Mardanish was descended from an Iberian Christian. I call him Ibn Mardanish not because I am convinced of this or because I think he is a bad guy and his name somehow shows why he's a bad guy, but simply because that's what he's known as in the scholarship. In some places, like in his coins, you'll see him refer to himself as Muhammad ibn Sa'ad, but I call him Ibn Mardanish throughout. So now I'll turn to his cultural production. Ibn Mardanish's cultural production highlights his attempt to connect himself to Islamic traditions of power in the East and to the most luxurious courts of the Mediterranean. His elaborate building projects garnered both praise and approbation from his contemporaries and successors. His gold coins became the currency of record in the Mediterranean for centuries after his death, and the legends they contained articulated Ibn Mardanish's association with the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates of the Near East and his rejection of Almohad ideology. Similarly, his architecture and the paintings and carved stucco that adorned its walls connected Ibn Mardanish with broader Islamic and Mediterranean forms of political power and challenged Almohad norms. In the year 1152, after nearly all of his fellow Andalusi rulers had submitted to the Almohads, Ibn Mardanish minted gold coins with a radically new legend, acknowledging that the Abbasid Caliph was his ruler by name, and given al-Andalus's long tradition of independence from the Abbasid Caliphate, and that even the pro-Abbasid Almoravids had never included the name of the Abbasid Caliph on their coins, Ibn Mardanish's decision to write the Caliph's full name demonstrates an unprecedented and dramatic shift in the ideology of independent rulership in al-Andalus. It sent a clear message to the Almohads that he was unwilling to acquiesce to their form of rule, and that he instead recognized the Sunni tradition embodied by the current Abbasid Caliph. So on the obverse, he wrote the standard beginning, there's no God but God, Muhammad is the messenger of God, and then he calls himself the Emir, Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Sa'ad, whom God supports, ayadahu Allah. But he also includes this line in the middle here. Ya'tasimu bihablillah, he holds fast to the rope of God. And we'll come back to talking about that in a minute. That's a really interesting addition as well. And on the reverse, we have there's no God but God. On the reverse, we have the Imam Abu Abdullah Muhammad al-Muqtafi, the Amr Allah, the Abbasid commander of the faithful, right? So al-Muqtafi al-Amr Allah is the Abbasid Caliph who's actually ruling at this moment in 548 Hijri, or 1152 of the Common Era. So let's come back to this, Ya'tasimu bihablillah. This is a reference to Quran 3:103, which exhorts believers to hold fast to the rope of God in order to avoid division within the Ummah, or global Muslim community. And the image of the rope of God was from the very earliest period in Islam associated with the caliphate. So Umayyad caliphs were frequently described as the embodiment of God's rope in panegyric poetry, connecting the believers to God. And the appropriation of this image in a political context implies that the believers must hold fast to the person of the ruler in order to avoid division and falling from the straight path. So Ibn Mardanish uses this Quranic phrase immediately before his name and in the third person singular indicative form, suggesting that he is the one holding fast to the rope of God, not that he himself is the rope of God. But he's reminding his subjects and rivals of his piety and of their duty to avoid division amongst themselves. And this phrase also suggests that Ibn Mardanish was consciously presenting himself as the defender of the caliphate and of the unity of believers. And we know that this coin circulated widely and that the Almohads saw it and were upset by it, because the Almohad Caliph followed the minting of this coin almost immediately with a letter saying, if you want to avoid falling from the straight path, you must submit to us. So this was a means of communication and contestation with the Almohads. So this is a direct attack on Almohad political ideology, and it undermines Almohad assertions to universal authority through reference to another caliph, that is the Abbasid Caliph, And by continuing the use of the Almoravid motto, which is Quran 385, which is around the margin of one of the, there we go, right here. This is the Almoravid motto, Quran 385, which says, whoever accepts a religion other than that of God, he has fallen from the straight path and he will be punished, essentially. I'll talk more about this a little bit later in the talk. So he's continuing the Almoravid motto, he's bringing in the Abbasids, he's using every ideological tool at his disposal to counteract the authority of the Almohads. And he does so in a way that both continues and surpasses Almoravid political language and forms. And we see this in other forms of his cultural production as well. The 14th century scholar al-Dhahabi wrote, based on a report from a 12th century author, that Ibn Mardanish spent his time in power, quote, busy bringing together those who could make machines of war, buildings, and delicate works of adornment, and he dedicated himself to constructing amazing citadels and great paths and gardens. These structures, some of which survive in some form, have been relatively understudied in part because of their terrible state of conservation. But the pioneering work of a couple of Spanish archaeologists, namely Julio Navarro Palazón and Pedro Jiménez Castillo, both excavated Ibn Mardanish's sites and also reconstructed elements of those sites that had been brought to various archaeological museums. And they've made further study of these buildings possible. So first I'll look at a site that they just excavated. It's inside a convent in Murcia, and by just, I mean like 15 years ago, but it feels recent still. This is Ibn Mardanish's palace in Murcia. It's called Dar as-Sughra, and it contains remarkable, elaborate stucco depictions of carved stucco of vegetal and zoomorphic themes, and also polychromatic figural paintings, which you saw when I started my presentation. Carved stucco, which was cheap and relatively easy to work, was well suited to the geometric and vegetal forms on vogue in the Islamic world and had become the standard material for the walls of Islamic palaces. And Ibn Mardanish's palace incorporates these stucco forms with lotus flowers and pine cones and palmettes curling around each other, as well as zoomorphic fragments, like this one, which is the legs and wings of a bird or harpy with a band of roundels across its wing, which suggests textiles with roundels on them. And fragments also survive of a program of frescoes painted on the interior niches of a Muqarnas dome. One surviving fragment shows a female musician playing the flute with legs bare as she dances. On her left, a man in a turban watches. Below, a bearded man is enclosed within an arch. These images are a direct attack on Almohad architectural austerity. Although their preferences for unadorned walls softened in later years, the Almohads never used figural paintings in their buildings. Where it did incorporate ornament, Almohad architecture used geometric and vegetal stucco designs very similar to those in Ibn Mardanish's palace. Ibn Mardanish, however, used these designs to frame girls dancing for princes, images that were not only directly opposed to Almohad artistic norms, but also their notoriously rigid attitudes toward music, dancing, and gatherings of mixed gender. The Almohads were known to be so opposed to figural representation and polychromy that the people of Fez preemptively whitewashed their congregational mosque the night before the triumphant arrival of the Almohad Caliph. These images were not purely anti-Almohad propaganda, however. They were also probably reflective of the activities that really took place within the walls of Ibn Mardanish's palace. Ibn al-Khatib, for example, reported that Ibn Mardanish loved drinking with his boon companions, who included his military commanders, and said that the ruler also used the songs of singing slave girls, qiyan, to win control over the hearts of the army. He also mentioned the ruler's great love for wind instruments and dancing, both of which seem to be depicted here. These activities and representations of them in courtly settings constituted the culture of many of the Andalusi courts that followed the fall of the Caliphate of Cordoba. Cynthia Robinson has shown how Omerid cultural production emphasized the ideals of courtly love, with drinking companions, musicians, and heartsick lovers arrayed in gardens, and how these ideals reverberated in the courts of the Taifa kingdoms and beyond. The illuminated manuscript of the love story of Bayad wa Riyad, which Robinson argues was produced in the 13th century in one of the anti-Almohad kingdoms of Sharq al-Andalus, portrays similar themes in strikingly similar forms, with drinkers and musicians portrayed in mixed gatherings. And Robinson sees this unique text as a product of Abbasid literary traditions and nascent European traditions of courtly love, which collided in al-Andalus and beginning in the Taifa period, and produced objects and texts with a new emphasis on courtly gathering, courtly love, and drinking in paradise-like gardens. Another example that Robinson raises is the Pamplona casket, which was produced for the Amrids, that is 300 years, or at least 200 years before this and before Ibn Mardanish's palace, or 150 years before Ibn Mardanish's palace. But again, this shows these scenes of leisure, often around just kind of tree of paradise, with seated men and sort of gender ambiguous young musicians playing various kinds of instruments and offering things to drink. This culture blossomed even further in the anti-Almohad courts of the 12th and 13th centuries. Two of the most famous textiles of the period, the drinking ladies textile that's now at the Cooper Hewitt, and the pillowcase of Berenguela, both of which are thought to have been produced in anti-Almohad courts of Sharq al-Andalus, or potentially in Castile, which is another interesting option that we'll come back to, reflect the same fixation on music, women, and drinking. Ibn Mardanish's court, as the locus of anti-Almohad power in the 12th century, was the bearer of this Andalusi tradition. But the paintings at Ibn Mardanish's palace also follow an ancient tradition of courtly culture adopted by the earliest Muslim rulers from Roman models, which frequently depict dancers, drinkers, musicians, and hunting scenes. Images of musicians and dancing girls were central components of the wall paintings in Umayyad and Abbasid palaces. This is another Umayyad one. And in the 11th and 12th centuries, these images were particularly in vogue in Fatimid Egypt, where they were painted on lusterware, like the ceramics being produced in Ibn Mardanish's Sharq al-Andalus. So these shallow bowls, made using a lusterware technique that had only just been mastered in Egypt in the 10th century, were of the highest value in the Mediterranean world and were used, as seen here, as bacchini, or decoration on the exterior of Pisan churches. Ibn Mardanish's Sharq al-Andalus was the first region in the Iberian Peninsula to master this technique of lusterware, and that was at some point in the mid-12th century. And some Italian bacchini have been identified as actually being from Murcia, reflecting an established trading relationship between Pisa and Sharq al-Andalus. Remember, Ibn Mardanish established a permanent trade post, a hostel for Pisan merchants in his ports. Such strong parallels exist in the techniques and motifs of these ceramics that prominent Spanish archaeologists have suggested that many of the bacchini attributed to Fatimid Egypt may in fact be of Murcian manufacture. So these are all ones that have been identified as Fatimid. But these images of female musicians and seated rulers also appear in North Africa. This is a bas-relief from Tunisia of a female musician performing on a wind instrument for a prince. And perhaps in what is the clearest parallel is that Ibn Mardanish had these paintings placed on the interior niches of a Muqarnas dome, which has since been destroyed. But this is a form that was used in similar ways in a bathhouse, a Fatimid bathhouse that also exists in fragments. This is from the 11th century, which shows a prince wearing a turban, seated in an arch, holding a vessel, and a dancing woman in the niche next to him. And the other, of course, parallel of this kind with images of music and dancing women painted inside niches is the Norman Capella Palatina. Shortly before Ibn Mardanish came to power, Norman King Roger II commissioned the construction of the Capella Palatina in Palermo, which was completed around 1144, and which incorporated paintings of fantastical animals, dancing girls, musicians, and banquets on its ceiling. And most scholars agree that this was probably produced by artists visiting from the Fatimid court. And here we have an image, a section of a carved ivory frame that has a dancing woman. This is produced in Fatimid Egypt, and this is one of the scarf dancers on the ceiling of the Capella Palatina. This is one of the reasons why people see this as being produced by Fatimid craftsmen. By engaging in this courtly tradition, Ibn Mardanish was tying himself explicitly to earlier Islamic courts, many of which use these images in palaces explicitly made for caliphs. And in including similar decorations in his own palace, Ibn Mardanish tied himself to the rich Islamic culture of the Mediterranean and to some of the most prosperous courts of his age. So this is just a comparison of the Fatimid, Bath, Muqarnas, and Ibn Mardanish's Muqarnas paintings. Ibn Mardanish's other palaces also present strong parallels to the Norman buildings constructed in the third quarter of the 12th century, the Zisa and the Quba. Like these Sicilian palaces, Ibn Mardanish's complex of palaces in Monte Agudo in the countryside outside of Murcia incorporated elaborate waterworks, gardens, and multi-story palaces with vistas across the gardens. These palaces were excavated in the 1920s and then left open and eventually planted as an orchard. One of the palaces became an orchard, and the other was used as a reservoir, so they have been almost entirely destroyed. The only elements that survive, besides the outside walls of these palaces, are the things that were taken in the 1920s to various archaeological museums in Spain. But again, these Spanish archaeologists, Julio Navarro Palazón and Pedro Jiménez de Castillo, have brought together the information that survives in various museums and have reconstructed what these buildings might have looked like. And they've also confirmed their attribution to Ibn Mardanish. So the two major structures of this palace complex are a castle that's on a very high hill and a smaller castle that's called the Castillejo on a lower hill. They also incorporated a noria or water wheel, pipes, canals, and aqueducts to carry water throughout the palaces and gardens, and elaborate terraced gardens. Like the Quba in Norman Palermo, which was completed around 1180, the design of these palaces included thick fortress-like walls with projecting towers along each facade, surrounded by park-like gardens. Ibn Mardanish's palaces also follow earlier Cordoban Umayyad models. As D.F. Ruggles has shown, the Castillo built on a platform made by buttress towers on top of a steep hill, and the lower Castillejo, built around a cross-axial courtyard with fountains and pools, serve as the intermediaries between Umayyad period palaces like Medinat al-Zahra and the Nasrid Alhambra. Like these earlier and later structures, Ibn Mardanish's castles incorporated elaborate waterworks and gardens as symbols of his cultivated kingdom, and vistas of the landscape from on high as representations of his sovereignty. The Castillejo was constructed with a central porticoed patio, off of which opened a reception hall and multiple alcoves, some of which likely contained miradors over his cultivated landscape. And this is the same model that would be used in the Zisa Palace of Norman Palermo and in the Alhambra. The interior of the Castillejo, like the remnants of late Almoravid architecture and the interior decorations of the Norman Zisa and Quba, is defined by carved stucco, which survives in fragments, as I say, at the National Archaeological Museum and the Regional Archaeological Museum of Murcia. Ibn Mardanish's palaces all continue the elaborate decorative forms of Almoravid carved stucco, especially the geometricized vegetal forms known as ataurique in Spanish, especially doubled palmettes and pine cones. He also introduces a particular phrase ubiquitous in the carved stucco of all of his buildings, al-Yuman wal-Iqbal, which you can see in this inscription along the top. Good fortune and prosperity, formed in rather strangely articulated bands of cursive or Naskhi script. This is one of his other palaces. This is Pino Hermoso, which I'm not talking about tonight. So Ibn Mardanish's buildings seem to stretch back to Umayyad and Abbasid and more frequently Almoravid examples, but they also constitute the earliest articulations of many forms that would become ubiquitous in the Nasrid and so-called Mudehar art and architecture that would follow him. One compelling example of this, as argued by Navarro Palazón and Jiménez Casillo, is that Ibn Mardanish is among the earliest to popularize anthropomorphic elements in carved vegetal stucco ornamentation, like this panel from the Castillejo, which is covered in deeply carved and overlapping vines that resolve down to a single point where one can just make out 3 little fingers holding the base of the plant. And here's a close-up. And this is something that appears much later. So this is mid to, I guess it's 3rd quarter of the 12th century. And this is from the 3rd quarter of the 14th century. This is from the synagogue of Samuel Halevi in Toledo. And this kind of tiny anthropomorphic form in the midst of geometric and vegetal forms also appears in a number of Mudéjar palaces, including the Capilla de la Asunción in Las Huelgas and in the Alhambra. So this is the earliest case that I know of this kind of anthropomorphic element inside of carved vegetal stucco ornamentation. And Navarro and Jimenez argue that this is an image of the ruler's hand holding abundance in the form of a leaf or palmette, symbolizing his power and the fertility of his land. I'm not sure if I entirely agree with their assessment, but it's an interesting argument. Much like his coinage, which called on earlier Islamic traditions to counteract growing Almohad influence, Ibn Mardanish's palace drew upon a long history of Islamic figurative art with courtly themes to undermine Almohad attitudes about art and culture. We know that these forms were seen as dangerous by his Almohad rivals because the 2 palaces at Monteagudo and his gardens were destroyed by Almohad armies in 1165. Almohad sources, including Ibn Sahib as-Salah, talk about the destruction of Ibn Mardanish's palaces and gardens in these attacks. And the poet Safwan ibn Idris related his discovery of 2 ruined fortified palaces that had been built by Ibn Mardanish in a trip he took in 1191. And the poet al-Kartajani referred to the Qasr of Ibn Sa'd, which is presumably one of these castles, in his Qasida Maqsura, recited to the Hafsid court, mourning the conquest of Sharq al-Andalus, and he compares these ruins to the legendary and similarly ruined White Palace of Al-Hira in Mesopotamia. This last reference from the 13th century is particularly interesting because the Palace of Al-Hira, constructed by the pre-Islamic Christian Lakhmid dynasty who allied with the Sasanians, became a topos in Abbasid poetry, simultaneously mourning the passage of time and the loss of beautiful spaces and things, and celebrating the arrival of Islam. So in choosing to associate Ibn Mardanish's palaces with the distant and ancient palaces of the Lakhmids, al-Kartajani must have meant to associate Ibn Mardanish with a kingdom whose time had passed and who needed to be conquered, in this case, I think the Castilians. His Hafsid audience, who were successors to the Almohads, certainly would have been more likely to see Ibn Mardanish as a cautionary tale and as somebody who is somewhat dangerous than as a hero. So in both his coinage and his architecture, Ibn Mardanish presented himself as a righteous Muslim ruler, attuned to the forms of power current in the Islamic East and in the Mediterranean world. In his coins inscriptions and the visual language of the paintings and stucco on his palace walls, Ibn Mardanish was arguing against the Almohad conception of the caliphate and in favor of a Sunni tradition of authority. And surrounding himself with the phrases and iconography associated with the Caliphate of the East, he was presenting himself as its standard bearer in the West. Ibn Mardanish's programs of legitimation had wide-ranging reverberations in the courts of both Christian and Muslim rulers who followed him. In fact, his cultural production served as a model for Castilian courtly culture well into the 14th century. We'll look first at how his coins became the model for the earliest Castilian gold coins, and then turn to how one element of his palace architecture was repeated in numerous Castilian buildings. Ibn Mardanish's coins, given in tribute to the courts of Barcelona, Aragon, and Castile, and the cities of Genoa and Pisa, were highly valued and remained a currency of record for these kingdoms even after his death. Latin Christian rulers north of Naples did not mint gold coins until the mid-13th century, with few exceptions, largely because of the difficulty they encountered in finding gold in substantial enough quantities to mint them. When medieval European rulers did mint gold coins, they did so on the model of Islamic gold coins. But many of the European gold coins imitating Islamic examples were crude copies, like the southern Italian versions of Roger's Taris that used Pseudo-Arabic inscriptions. The first gold coins minted by the rulers of Iberia, however, were perfectly legible and employed inscriptions that emulated but Christianized earlier Islamic examples. Nearly immediately after Ibn Mardanish's death, his ally, Alfonso VIII, who called Ibn Mardanish his vassal, minted a gold dinar that mirrored the design and inscriptions of Ibn Mardanish's dinars. In addition to following the style of Ibn Mardanish's coinage, Alfonso also included Arabic inscriptions that directly countered the ideological claims of Ibn Mardanish's legends with Christian ones, which showed an engagement with the political and religious ideas presented by Ibn Mardanish. Furthermore, a close examination of the coins confirms that Alfonso VIII's gold dinars were based on the specific model of the coins he'd been receiving in tribute from Ibn Mardanish for years. The inscriptions on Alfonso's dinars were clearly crafted in response to Ibn Mardanish's dinars. So the central legend on the reverse of Ibn Mardanish's coin from 548 of the Hijra reads, I'll just remind you of it. There's no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God. The Emir Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Sa'd, whom God supports, holds fast to the rope of God. That's what that legend said. And here, Alfonso's 1181 dinars central legend reads, Amir al-Katulikin, Alphonse bin Sanja, ayadahu Allah wa nasarahu. Commander of the Catholics, Alfonso, son of Sancho, whom God supports and helps. On the obverse, we have a cross at the top, and also a little addition of the Latin letters ALF. For those who can't read Arabic and don't know that this is a coin produced by Alfonso, there's a little cheat sheet. And it says, the Imam, it says, El-Imam, El-Bi'a, El-Masihiyya, Baba, Ruma, Al-Azama. The Imam of the Christian Church is the Pope of Rome, the Most Great. So on Ibn Mardanish's coin, it says the Imam, Abdullah the Abbasid, commander of the faithful. Here, the Imam of the church, the Imam is the Imam of the Christian Church is the Pope of Rome, the Most Great. And in the marginal legend on Alfonso's coin, it reads in Arabic, Bismil Abbi wal Ibni wa Ruhi al Qudus, Allah al-Wahid, man amana wa ta'ammad yakun salima. So in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, with the one God, whoever believes and is baptized will be saved. Compare this to the Quranic legend on Ibn Mardanish's coin, which is from Quran 385. Oh yeah, of course that is from Mark 16:16. It's a biblical quote on Alfonso's coin. And on Ibn Mardanish's coin, it's Quranic, and it says, whosoever desires a religion other than Islam, it will never be accepted from him, and in the hereafter, he will be among the losers. So there is an excerpt from the New Testament about the exclusivity of the Christian faith and the importance of being saved through baptism, countering the excerpt from the Quran, characteristic of Almoravid and later Iberian coinage, which warns that anybody who accepts any religion other than Islam will be condemned in the afterlife. So the process of translating Ibn Mardanish's coin into a visually similar version, more suitable for a Christian king, reflects an engagement with its meaning and its connections across space and time. So writing the Imam of the Christian Church is the Pope of Rome, the Most Great, reveals that Alfonso understood that Ibn Mardanish was legitimating his authority through a distant imam who was leader of the Islamic world, and minting his coin in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, God the One, reflected an understanding of the doctrinal differences in Islamic and Christian conceptions about God's unity. To Alfonso, Ibn Mardanish's coins were not just illegible chunks of gold with pleasing patterns. Alfonso's dinar shows that he understood at least some of the meanings, even if he didn't comprehend all of the associations gold coins might have had in an Islamic context. The networks that linked Ibn Mardanish's coins to Damascus, to Baghdad, and to sub-Saharan gold mines may have been invisible to Alfonso, but the power of the gold, presenting the ruler's wealth and reach, and of the form, rooted in centuries of power in the Islamic West, and even of the inscriptions with their opposition to the Almohads, were clearly legible to Alfonso. Further parallels, and I have this slide which I should have had up earlier. This is his inscription on Alfonso's coins. So further parallels confirm that the Castilian king's dinar was designed in direct response to those of Ibn Mardanish, that each sentence, decorative flourish, and design element was formed in conversation with the dinar of his former vassal. Many of Ibn Mardanish's coins have a small decoration under the inscription that starts al-Imam. Here, a little star and a series of beads and circles. In some cases, he has flowers. And Alfonso VIII's dinars have the same decoration under the inscription about the Imam, a flower above a series of small dots on his earliest dinars and a series of dots under the ALF of the dinars minted in his name between 1214 and 1217. Alfonso would have seen his addition of a Christian message and of his own name as augmenting the power and prestige of Ibn Mardanish's dinar. By creating his own version of this dinar, filling its lines with a Christian message and proclaiming himself the emir, Alfonso asserted a new kind of ownership, far surpassing anything that would have been possible with Ibn Mardanish's coins. And in doing so, Alfonso's dinar shows how the coins of Ibn Mardanish that he possessed had in turn come to possess him, transforming his own ideas about coinage and authority. It was not just Ibn Mardanish's coinage that continued in new forms after his death. An inscription used throughout his palace in Murcia, which we can just see the edge of here, al-Yuman wal-Iqbal, repeated in these sort of strange orthographic, it has a strange orthography, and it continues in these bands ribboning around architectural elements in all of his palaces. Every single one of his palaces has this inscription in cursive. There are other inscriptions in Kufic that are usually religious. This one, which is just this well-wishing aphorism, good fortune and prosperity, spreads across everything in cursive. And it continued to reverberate in later Iberian royal culture. At about the same time that Alfonso's son was minting a second set of dinars in his father's name in Toledo, that is around 1220, a small church was tacked onto the back of a mosque in Toledo to commemorate Alfonso's victory against the Almohads and their ultimate defeat at the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa. The diminutive church, called San Cristo de la Luz, is dominated by an image of Christ in majesty that fills its central wall. And in the arch that surrounds this central wall, that surrounds the apse, runs a band of Arabic inscription, the very same inscription, al-Yuman wal-Iqbal, that first appeared in Ibn Mardanish's palace, and it is painted in the same style and with the same orthographic anomalies. This same inscription is also found in the Church of San Roman in Toledo, framing saints, church fathers, and angels, as well as windows and arches. Both churches were decorated around 1220 in the aftermath of the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa as celebrations of the victory of the Castilians and their allies against the Almohads. In fact, San Roman, this church, was reconsecrated following being painted with this inscription and remarkable scenes of the Day of Judgment by none other than the historian and Archbishop Rodrigo Jimenez Terrada, whose positive assessment of Ibn Mardanish began this talk. I just want to point out one other thing about this church of San Roman. It's all painted. It's not obviously not carved stucco, but the patterns are made to look very, very similar to the carved stucco patterns that adorn the spandrels of and the alfizes and the alternating voussoirs of Ibn Mardanish's palaces. So in this case, they're painted on, but we have the same sort of knotted borders around the arches and the same alternating voussoirs filled with vegetal ornamentation, although in the case of Ibn Mardanish's palace, the material is different. It's carved and it's three-dimensional, and here it's two-dimensional and painted. There's a lot I could talk about. I wrote my undergraduate thesis on this church. There's a lot to talk about in this church. So this inscription doesn't just stop in the 1220s, though. It persists in various forms going on to the 15th century in Christian churches and palaces and synagogues, and eventually in the Alhambra as well. It appears in the 14th century Castilian convent and palace of Las Huelgas, framing the space occupied by saints such as Saint James and Mary. So the inscription is not the Kufic inscription, which runs here, but these bands of naskhi. I'll give you a close-up here. These bands of naskhi that go underneath their feet and that frame other more legible, more easily legible Kufic inscriptions. And also in the same buildings in roundels around regal peacocks. And it appears in bands that surround Hebrew inscriptions from the Torah in the 14th century synagogue of Castilian King Peter I's finance minister, Samuel Halevi. This is the same synagogue where the little hand comes from. Eventually, it appears amidst the copious and poetic dedicatory inscriptions of the Nasrid Alhambra and also the objects that likely decorated it, like this Alhambra vase. These inscriptions in buildings constructed by non-Muslim the inscriptions in buildings painted by non-Muslim patrons are treated cursorily by scholars who either largely ignore them or call them Quranic inscriptions snuck in by Muslim workmen. This improbable explanation reflects an understanding of art and architecture as having an unwavering religious identity, and transgressions of religious boundaries is only possible through acts of subversion. Like Ibn Mardanish himself, whose alliances with Christians only made sense to post-Reconquista scholars if he was a crypto-Christian, these inscriptions are forced into a polarized framework in which even carved stucco must decide if it is Christian or Muslim, with us or against us. In all of these contexts, the inscription wraps ribbon-like around images or carved stucco, just as it once did in Ibn Mardanish's palaces, suggesting a function that married decorative appeal and talismanic or apotropaic power. I believe Ibn Mardanish adapted this inscription for architectural use from Fatimid inscribed textiles, which have been shown to have apotropaic associations in Egyptian burials. Perhaps for Ibn Mardanish, this inscription simultaneously evoked the luxury of the preeminent textiles of the day and a certain kind of protective power. Certainly, for the rulers who followed him, this inscription accrued new meanings, especially through its connection to Ibn Mardanish, the greatest Andalusian opponent of the Almohads. And if we follow back the temporal and geographic linkages that stretch out from this inscription or from the paintings in Ibn Mardanish's palaces or Alfonso's gold dinar, we find an overlapping web that stretches from Toledo to Murcia, then to North Africa, Syria, and Iraq. This matrix connects the Mediterranean and Islamic worlds, dissolving national and cultural boundaries. Ibn Mardanish's court functioned as a kind of a hinge, translating and transforming objects and motifs from the caliphates of the East that would then find new lives in the courts of the Iberian Peninsula. I want to emphasize that I do not see the travels of these motifs as reflecting the passive absorption of influence from an Islamic cultural center to a periphery. Instead, I see the active mediation and translation of circulating technologies and iconography, producing resonant new forms that continue to transform and be transformed as they continue to move. Modern scholarship has a purifying and categorizing impulse to separate out the mixed up worlds of the past, to make sense of people and things by putting them into the appropriate bucket. Ibn Mardanish is good to think with because he's so hard to classify. A Muslim with a strange name, it's not Arabic, who sleeps around and drinks to excess with his army of Christian mercenaries, who pledges allegiance to the Abbasid Caliph even as he acts as a loyal vassal to the King of Castile. His cultural production and its echoes in the Iberian Peninsula after his death are similarly slippery, moving from one bucket to the next with an ease that unsettles modern scholars. Ibn Mardanish highlights the futility of trying to make complex figures cohere to the kind of single-note, simple identity we far too often attribute to people from the past. His treatment in the sources and that of the Islamic motifs and objects produced by Christians and Jews reveals the shortcomings of scholarly disciplines arranged according to modern national and religious frameworks. Thank you.